The rain had been falling all afternoon, a steady gray curtain that blurred the edges of the city and turned the playground outside the Oakwood Children's Home into a sea of puddles. Inside, the old building smelled of warm bread, floor polish, and something faintly sweet, like crayons left too long in the sun. Most of the kids were gathered in the common room, playing board games or watching cartoons on a slightly fuzzy TV. But in the far corner, near a window streaked with raindrops, a small girl sat alone at the piano. It wasn't much of a piano, just an old upright. Its wood scratched and one of the pedals squeaked when pressed. The keys were yellowed with age and the middle C had a tiny chip on the edge. But to her it was everything. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not playing anything yet, just feeling the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. Her name wasn't called often and she rarely volunteered it. But if you asked, she'd say it softly. Maya. She'd been at Oakwood for 5 years now. She didn't remember much about her life before, just flashes. A woman humming while kneading dough, the smell of lavender soap, and the sound of piano music drifting through a sunlit room. Her mother had played, not professionally, just for joy. She'd sit at their little keyboard in the living room after dinner, playing simple tunes while Maya danced in her socks. Then came the accident, a rainy night, screeching tires, silence. After that, her father couldn't look at her without his eyes filling with pain. One morning, he dropped her off at Oakwood with a stuffed rabbit and a backpack that smelled like his cologne. He never came back. At first, Maya barely spoke. She'd sit in corners, arms wrapped around herself, flinching at loud noises. But one day, she wandered into the music room and saw the piano. No one had touched it in months. It was considered more of a decoration than an instrument. But she sat down, placed her small hands on the keys and pressed one. The note rang out clear and warm, cutting through the quiet like a voice. From that moment, the piano became her refuge. She taught herself. The home didn't have money for lessons, but the local library was only 2 blocks away. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, she'd walk there with her lunchbox still slung over her shoulder and check out beginner piano books. She'd study them under the flickering fluorescent lights of the common room long after bedtime. Using a flashlight when the house mother turned off the main lights, she watched videos on the one old computer the home shared, pausing and rewinding until her fingers could mimic what she saw. Her hands were small, but they were strong, from scrubbing dishes, folding laundry, helping younger kids tie their shoes, and they learned quickly. Now at 10 years old, she could play pieces that made even the sternest house mother pause in the doorway, eyes softening. She never played for attention. She played because when her fingers moved across the keys, the world outside, the unanswered letters, the empty chair at dinner, the way adults sometimes looked at her with pity, faded away. In those moments, she wasn't the girl no one wanted. She was someone who could make beauty out of silence. That afternoon, as the rain drummed against the windows, she began to play. Not a loud or flashy piece, but Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. She'd found the sheet music in a donated box of old books, its pages brittle and stained with coffee rings. She'd spent weeks learning it, practicing in stolen moments between chores and homework. Her version wasn't perfect. She missed a few notes, her timing wobbled slightly in the middle, but it carried something deeper than technique. It carried longing. It carried hope. Outside, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, tires hissing on the wet pavement. A man in a dark overcoat stepped out, holding a large umbrella. He looked around with the kind of impatience people get when they're doing something they think is beneath them. This was Richard Holloway, a name that appeared in business magazines, real estate headlines, and charity galas. He owned half the luxury condos downtown and had a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and utterly uninterested in sentimentality. He was only here because his public relations team had insisted. It's good optics, they'd said. People love seeing successful men give back. So he'd agreed to visit Oakwood Children's Home for a quick photo op, shake a few small hands, smile for the camera, write a check, and be back in his office before lunch was cold. He stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. The director, Mrs. Alvarez, a woman with kind eyes and steel gray hair pulled into a neat bun, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Holloway, we're so glad you could make it." "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He glanced around the room, taking in the worn furniture, the mismatched toys, the children watching him with cautious curiosity. To him, it all looked messy, unorganized. He preferred things clean, controlled, predictable. Mrs. Alvarez led him through the common room, introducing him to a few of the older kids. He gave polite nods, shook tiny hands with the kind of careful distance one might use when handling fragile glass. Then they passed the piano. Maya hadn't noticed them. She was deep in the music, eyes closed, swaying slightly as her fingers danced over the keys. The room had gone quiet. Even the TV had been turned down. Everyone knew when Maya played, you listened. Richard stopped mid-step. Is that a child playing that? Mrs. Alvarez smiled. That's Maya. She's been teaching herself for years. She's quite gifted, he raised an eyebrow. Gifted at her age? He sounded skeptical, almost amused. He walked closer, arms crossed. Maya opened her eyes, startled, and her fingers froze on the keys. The music stopped abruptly, leaving a hollow silence. It's okay, sweetheart, Mrs. Alvarez said gently. Keep going. But Maya shook her head, cheeks flushing. She slid off the bench and stood quietly, eyes downcast. Richard looked at her. Really looked. She was small for her age, wearing faded jeans and a sweater 2 sizes too big. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, strands escaping around her face. There was something about her stillness that unnerved him. Most kids either clung to strangers or hid behind furniture. She just stood there like she'd already decided he wasn't worth her energy. Mrs. Alvarez tried to lighten the mood. Maya's dream is to play in a real concert hall someday. Richard chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Is that so? He glanced at the old piano, then back at the girl. Without thinking, almost as a joke to break the tension, he said, well, if she can really play the piano, really play, I'll adopt her. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Alvarez's smile faltered. A few kids gasped. Maya didn't move, but her breath caught, just slightly. Richard immediately regretted it. It had been a throwaway line, the kind of thing rich men say to sound generous without meaning it. But now everyone was looking at him, waiting. He cleared his throat. I mean, it was just a figure of speech. You know how it is. But Maya had already turned back to the piano. She climbed onto the bench again, adjusted her sweater, and placed her hands on the keys. This time she didn't close her eyes. She looked straight ahead, jaw set as if bracing for a storm, and then she began to play. Not the Chopin this time, but something deeper, more complex. A piece she'd been saving, one she only played when she felt brave. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. Slow, haunting, full of quiet sorrow and stubborn light. Her fingers moved with a confidence that defied her age. The notes flowed like water, smooth, inevitable, alive. The squeaky pedal didn't matter. The chipped key didn't matter. All that mattered was the music pouring out of her, raw and honest. Richard stood frozen. He'd heard world-class pianists in grand halls. He'd paid for private concerts in his own penthouse. But he'd never heard anything like this. Not because it was technically flawless, it wasn't, but because it meant something. Every note carried a story, of loss, of loneliness, of a child who kept trying anyway. The room was utterly still. Even the rain seemed to quiet down. When the last note faded into silence, no one moved for a long moment. Then one of the younger kids started clapping. Others joined in until the whole room was filled with warm, thunderous applause. Maya didn't smile. She just looked at Richard, her dark eyes steady. He felt something crack inside his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt, wonder, shame. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but all that came out was a weak, I was just joking. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. She heard you, Mr. Holloway, and she believed you. He didn't know what to say. He mumbled something about the check being in the car, shook Mrs. Alvarez's hand too quickly, and left without looking back. But as he drove away, the image of that small girl at the piano stayed with him. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Holloway didn't feel like a man in control. He felt like a man who'd just made a promise he never intended to keep, and might not be able to forget. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and heavy, like a damp blanket over the city. Inside Oakwood, the usual rhythm of breakfast clatter and morning chatter filled the air, spoons clinking against bowls, sneakers squeaking on linoleum, the house mother calling out reminders about homework and chores. But in the music room, everything was quiet. Maya sat on the piano bench, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't touched the keys since yesterday. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Ma's face. The sharp lines of his jaw, the way his eyes had narrowed when he made that joke. And then the way they'd changed when she played. Not to kindness exactly. More like surprise. Like he'd seen something he didn't expect and didn't know what to do with it. She kept replaying his words in her head. If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her. Said like it was nothing. Like she was a toy in a prize booth at a carnival. And yet part of her had believed it. Not because she thought he meant it, but because for one wild, foolish second, she let herself imagine what it would be like. A real home. Someone waiting at the door when she came back from school. A piano that didn't squeak. Maybe even someone who'd come to her recitals. But then he'd walked away. Just like that. And the worst part? She hadn't cried. She'd just felt tired. Like she'd used up all her hope on a moment that wasn't real. Mrs. Alvarez found her there an hour later, still sitting in silence. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled up a chair and sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close it felt pushy. He came back, she said finally, her voice soft. Maya's head snapped up. What? Mr. Holloway, he's in my office. Wants to talk to you. Maya's stomach dropped. Why? I don't know, Mrs. Alvarez admitted. But he looks different. Less sure of himself, Maya didn't move. I don't want to see him. You don't have to, Mrs. Alvarez said gently. But I think you should hear what he has to say. Maya hesitated. Then slowly she stood up, smoothed her sweater, and followed. In the small office, the man stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the wet courtyard. He turned when they entered, and for a moment no one spoke. He looked less polished today. His tie slightly crooked, his hair messy like he'd run his hands through it too many times. He didn't smile. I'm not here to adopt you, he said right away, as if getting it out would make it easier. Maya nodded. She'd expected that. I came to make things right, he continued, shifting his weight. What I said yesterday, it was careless, thoughtless. I didn't mean it as a promise. I was just trying to fill the silence. Maya looked down at her shoes. One of the laces was frayed. I've written a check, he went on, pulling an envelope from his coat. A substantial one. It'll cover new instruments for the music program, updated books, maybe even a proper piano teacher once a week. Whatever you need. He held it out. Mrs. Alvarez took it, but Maya didn't look up. There was a long pause. Then quietly Maya said, Did you like the music? He blinked, caught off guard. What, the Beethoven? Did you like it? He swallowed. Yes, he said, and this time it sounded real. I've never heard it played like that. Because it wasn't just notes, she said, still not looking at him. It was how I felt. He didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever explained music to him that way. To him, music was background noise at dinners, something elegant to impress guests, not something that carried a person's heart. I'm sorry, he said finally. It was the first time he'd ever apologized to a child. Maya lifted her eyes then. Not with anger, not with hope, just with quiet honesty. Do you still mean what you said? He froze. I told you I didn't mean it as a... But you said it, she interrupted, voice steady. And I played, so... Do you still mean it? He stared at her. In that moment, she wasn't just a kid in a too-big sweater. She was someone who held him to his word, even a careless one. And that terrified him more than any business deal ever had. I can't just... Adopt someone, he said, almost pleading. It's not that simple. Then don't, she said simply. But don't pretend you didn't say it. He left an hour later. The check accepted, the apology noted, but the question hanging in the air like smoke. That night, back in his penthouse high above the city, he couldn't sleep. The lights of downtown glittered below, but all he could see was that small room, that old piano, and the way her fingers had moved, like they knew secrets the rest of the world had forgotten. He poured himself a drink, then poured it back out. He turned on the TV, then turned it off. He walked to the grand piano in his living room, a beautiful silent instrument he'd bought because it looked impressive, and ran a hand over the lid. It had never been played. Not once. He sat down, pressed a key. The note echoed in the empty space, lonely and hollow. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed. 3 days later, he returned to Oakwood. Not with a camera crew, not with a checkbook, but alone. He asked to speak with Maya again. This time she agreed. They met in the music room. She was practicing scales, slow and deliberate. "I've been thinking," he said, standing near the door like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come in. What if I took you in? Just for a while. Foster care. Not adoption, just see how it goes." Maya stopped playing. "Why?" "Because," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you deserve a chance to grow. And that piano, it's holding you back. You need a real instrument, a real teacher. And I can give you that." She studied him. "Is this because you feel bad?" "Yes," he admitted. "But also, I want to hear you play again. In a place where the music doesn't get lost in the walls." She thought about it, then nodded. "Okay, but only if I can come back here anytime I want." "Of course," he said, surprised by how relieved he felt. The paperwork took 2 weeks. Social workers came, interviews were held, background checks run. Maya packed her few belongings: a change of clothes, her stuffed rabbit, a notebook filled with music scribbles, and the sheet music for the Moonlight Sonata. On the morning she left, the other kids lined the hallway, some crying, others giving her awkward hugs. Mrs. Alvarez pressed a small photo into her hand. Maya at the piano, taken last Christmas. "So you never forget where you came from," she whispered. The drive to the penthouse was quiet. Maya stared out the window, watching the city blur past. The man, she still didn't think of him as anything else, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, like he was afraid she'd vanish. His home was nothing like Oakwood. Everything was sleek, quiet, expensive. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. In the center of the living room stood a black grand piano, polished to a mirror shine. "It's yours," he said, "whenever you want to play." She walked over, touched the keys. They were cool, smooth, perfect. She pressed one. The sound was rich, full, alive. That night, for the first time in years, she slept in a room with a door that closed. No shared bathrooms, no midnight whispers from other beds. Just silence. And for a moment it felt like freedom. But the next morning things got complicated. He tried to be kind in his awkward way. He bought her new clothes, too fancy, too stiff. He enrolled her in a private school but didn't ask if she wanted to go. He hired a piano teacher, a stern woman with silver hair who spoke in sharp tones and corrected every tiny mistake. Maya hated it. At Oakwood, music had been hers, private, personal. Now it felt like another performance, another thing to get right. Worse, he didn't know how to talk to her. He'd ask stiff questions at dinner. "How was school? Did you practice?" And when she gave short answers, he'd fall silent. He worked late most nights. Sometimes she'd hear him on the phone in his study, voice sharp and commanding. The same tone he'd used at Oakwood that first day. One evening, after a particularly frustrating lesson, she sat at the piano but didn't play. She just stared at the keys, tears welling in her eyes. He found her like that. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she mumbled. "Don't say nothing," he said, sitting beside her on the bench. "Talk to me." She took a shaky breath. "At Oakwood, I played because it made me feel better. Here, it feels like a test. Like I have to be perfect or I'll disappoint you." He looked stunned. "I don't expect you to be perfect, but you expect me to be something," she said. "I don't know what. A daughter? A project? A piano player who makes you look good?" He flinched. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But it's how it feels." He didn't argue. He just sat there staring at his hands. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I've never had to care about someone like this before." She looked at him then, not as the rich man, not as the stranger who made a joke, but as someone trying, however clumsily. "Then stop trying to fix me," she said. "Just be here." He nodded slowly. "Okay." The next day he canceled his afternoon meetings. He sat in the living room while she practiced, not watching, not judging, just reading a book, letting the music fill the space between them. When she played a wrong note, he didn't react. When she laughed at herself, he smiled. And when she played the nocturne again, the piece she'd played that rainy day, he closed his eyes and just listened. Over the next few weeks, things shifted. He started asking her opinions, what she wanted for dinner, which park to visit on weekends. He learned she liked strawberry milk, hated carrots, and loved old detective movies. She learned he drank his coffee black, kept a photo of his late wife on his nightstand, and always hummed when he was nervous. One Saturday, He took her to a music store. Not to buy anything, just to listen. They wandered through aisles of instruments, and when they reached the pianos, he said, "Play something." She chose a baby grand in the corner, sat down, played a simple folk tune she'd learned from a library book. People stopped to listen. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is she famous?" She wasn't. But in that moment she felt seen. Not for where she came from, not for what she could do, but Jew. Saint for who she was. On the drive home she asked, "Why did you really come back?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Because after you played I couldn't stop thinking about you. And I realized, I've spent my whole life building things that don't matter. Buildings deals money. But you made something real. And I didn't want to walk away from that." She didn't say anything. But she leaned her head against the car window and smiled. Just a little. That night she played for him again. Not Beethoven, not Chopin. Just a simple melody she'd made up herself. Soft, hopeful, full of quiet joy. And for the first time he didn't just hear the notes. He heard her. Life in the penthouse settled into a rhythm like a piece of music finding its tempo. Mornings began with the soft clink of coffee cups and the rustle of newspaper pages. Afternoons were filled with school, piano practice, and the occasional walk through the nearby park where Maya would point out birds or funny-shaped clouds. Evenings often ended with the two of them on the couch, her curled up with a book, him scrolling through emails but glancing over every few minutes to make sure she was still there. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward silences, misunderstandings, moments when he'd slip back into his old habits, making decisions without asking, speaking in that clipped tone he used in boardrooms. But something had shifted. He no longer treated her like a guest or a project. She was just there, part of the quiet hum of his life. And then came the invitation. It arrived in a crisp white envelope addressed to both of them. A local music academy was hosting a student recital, and Maya's piano teacher had recommended her to perform. It wasn't a big event, just parents, teachers, and a few community members, but to Maya it felt enormous. She'd never played in front of strangers before, not really. At Oakwood, the audience was made up of people who already knew her, who clapped because they cared. This was different. This was judgment. She showed him the letter at dinner, fingers trembling slightly. He read it carefully, then looked up. "Do you want to do it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "What if I mess up?" "You won't," he said simply. "But even if you do, it won't matter. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about sharing something true." She blinked. That sounded like something she would say, not him. He noticed her surprise and gave a small, almost shy smile. "I've been listening." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of practice. She chose Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu, a piece full of speed, emotion, and technical challenge. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but she loved how it surged and fell like waves. He cleared his schedule the week before the recital. No late nights at the office, no business calls during dinner. Instead, he sat in the living room every evening, reading or pretending to read while she practiced. Sometimes he'd bring her a glass of water. Sometimes he'd just sit quietly, letting the music wrap around them both. The night before the performance, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, heart pounding, imagining every possible mistake, the wrong note, a skipped measure, her hands freezing mid-song. Around midnight, she got up and padded down the hall. The living room light was still on. He was there in his robe, staring out the window at the city lights. "I can't sleep," she said softly. He turned. "Nervous?" She nodded. He didn't offer empty reassurance. Didn't say, "You'll be fine." Instead, he walked to the piano, sat down, and played a single note, middle C, then another. Then a simple scale, slow and steady. "Remember your first lesson here?" he asked. "You told me music isn't about the notes. It's about what's behind them." She sat beside him on the bench. "I'm scared no one will hear what's behind them." "They will," he said. "Because it's honest, and honest things always find their way." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. For the first time, it felt natural, like they belonged in the same space, not just sharing a roof, but sharing a moment. The day of the recital arrived. He wore a dark suit. She wore a simple navy dress Mrs. Alvarez had helped pick out during a visit the week before. He drove her himself, hand steady on the wheel, voice calm as he pointed out silly things along the way. a dog wearing sunglasses, a street performer juggling flaming torches, to keep her mind off the performance. The recital hall was small but elegant, with warm wood floors and soft lighting. Parents chatted in clusters, children fidgeted in their seats, teachers moved about with clipboards. Maya's hands were cold. He noticed and, without a word, took one of her hands in his and held it until the color came back. When her name was called, she stood slowly. He gave her a nod, just a small one, but it said everything. "I'm here. I believe in you." She walked to the grand piano on the stage, sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and froze. The room was too quiet. Too many eyes. Her mind went blank. The opening notes of the Fantaisie Impromptu vanished like smoke. Panic rose in her chest. She glanced toward the audience and saw him. Not smiling, not urging her on. Just watching, waiting, trusting her. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and began, not the Chopin, not the piece she'd practiced for weeks. Instead, she played the melody she'd made up that night in the penthouse, the simple, hopeful tune that had no name but felt like home. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't difficult. But it was hers, and as she played, something amazing happened. The room leaned in, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity, out of connection. When she finished, there was a beat of silence, then warm, genuine applause. Not thunderous, but real. Afterward, people came up to her. A woman with kind eyes said, "That was beautiful. It felt like you were telling a story." A little boy asked, "Did you write that yourself?" She nodded, and he grinned like he'd just met a superhero. He waited by the door, hands in his pockets. When she reached him, he didn't say, "Great job," or "I knew you could do it." He just said, "Thank you for sharing that." She smiled. "Thank you for listening." For a few days, everything felt lighter. They went out for ice cream, watched a movie with the lights off, laughed over burnt toast one morning. It felt for the first time like they were building something real, not out of obligation but out of choice. But then the call came. He was in his study, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. She overheard snippets. "Yes, I understand. The Tokyo deal. I'll be on the next flight. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Her stomach dropped. That night at dinner, he told her. A major business opportunity had come up, something he couldn't pass on. He'd have to travel to Asia for several weeks. He'd arranged for a housekeeper to stay with her, and her school would be notified. Everything would be taken care of. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She just pushed her food around her plate and said, "Okay." But the next morning, when he kissed her forehead before leaving for the airport, she whispered, "Will you be back before my next recital?" He paused. I don't know." "It's a big project," she nodded. It's okay, it wasn't okay. But she'd learned long ago not to expect people to stay. The weeks that followed were quiet. Too quiet. The housekeeper was kind but distant, focused on chores and schedules. School felt dull. Even the piano seemed to echo with emptiness. She practiced, but the music felt flat, like she was going through the motions. One afternoon she called Oakwood. Mrs. Alvarez answered. "How are you, sweetheart?" she asked, voice warm with concern. "I'm fine," Maya said. But then quietly, "He's gone." There was a pause. "He'll come back, will he?" Maya asked. "Or will he forget? Like everyone else?" "Oh, honey," Mrs. Alvarez said gently. "Some people leave because they don't care, but some leave because they don't know how to stay. Give 'em a chance." But the days turned into weeks, and the recital came and went. She played again, this time the Chopin, perfectly. But he wasn't there. No one was, really. Just a few parents and teachers. Afterward, she walked home alone, the city lights blurring through unshed tears. Then, one rainy evening, just like the day they'd met, he walked through the door. He looked exhausted. Suit wrinkled, eyes shadowed, suitcase in hand. He dropped it by the door and stood in the hallway like he wasn't sure he was welcome. She was sitting at the piano, not playing, just staring at the keys. "I'm back," he said. She didn't turn around. "I saw your email. You said you might be gone another week." "I cut the trip short," he said. I missed this. Did you miss me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Then, every single day, she finally looked at him. "You missed my recital." I know, he said, shame heavy in his voice. I thought the deal was more important. But it wasn't, nothing is. She stood up, walked over to him. Not to hug him, just to stand close. I played the Chopin. The one I practiced for you. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. She nodded. Then, after a long silence, do you know why I stayed? He shook his head. Because I believed you'd come back, she said, even when it didn't make sense. He swallowed hard. I don't deserve that. Maybe not, she said, but I gave it anyway. That night, they ordered pizza and ate it on the floor of the living room like kids. He told her about the trip, the long flights, the boring meetings, the way he'd listened to recordings of her playing on his phone just to feel close to home. She told him about school, the new song she was writing, how the housekeeper let her stay up late watching old movies. And for the first time, he didn't just listen. He heard him, but the real test came a few days later. His assistant called during breakfast. The board wants you in New York tomorrow. It's urgent. The merger. He looked at Maya, who was stirring her cereal slowly, not looking up. I can't, he said into the phone. I have a prior commitment. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, this is the biggest deal of the year. I know, he said, but I'm not available. He hung up. Maya finally looked at him. What was that? Nothing important, he said. And for the first time, it was true. Later that afternoon, he surprised her with tickets to a symphony concert. Not because it was fancy, but because he remembered her saying she'd never been to one. They sat in the middle of the hall, surrounded by strangers, as the orchestra filled the space with sound so powerful it vibrated in their chests. During intermission, she turned to him and said, You're different now. How? You don't look at your watch every 5 minutes, she said with a small smile. You actually listen when I talk, and you stayed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I realized something while I was away. I spent my whole life chasing things I thought would make me happy. Money, success, control. But none of it mattered when I was sitting in a hotel room halfway across the world, missing the sound of someone playing piano in the next room. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm glad you came back. I'm not going anywhere, he said. And this time she believed him. That night, back home, she played for him again. Not to impress, not to prove anything, just because she wanted to. And as the music filled the room, he didn't just sit and listen. He stayed. Things had been good, really good for a while. The kind of good that feels quiet and steady, like sunlight through a window on a calm morning. He'd stopped missing dinners. He'd learned to ask before making plans. He even started humming along when she practiced, though he always got the tune wrong, which made her laugh. She'd begun calling him Dad in her head, though she hadn't said it out loud yet. It still felt too big, too fragile, like a glass bird she was afraid to hold. But then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between bills and a grocery store flyer. Thick paper, official looking. She saw it on the kitchen counter when she came home from school. He was already at the table reading it, his face unreadable. What is it? She asked, dropping her backpack by the door. He looked up, and for a second she saw something flicker in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in months. Distance, worry, the old walls creeping back up. It's nothing, he said, folding the letter quickly. Just paperwork. She didn't believe him. Not because he was lying, but because she knew that look. It was the same look he'd worn the day he left for Asia. The look of a man about to disappear into his work and forget the world outside his office. That night, she heard him on the phone in his study. His voice was low, but she caught enough. Yes, I understand. The investors are expecting results. I'll be there. No, I can't postpone it. Her stomach tightened. The next morning, over breakfast, she asked again, Are you going away? He hesitated, then sighed. There's a meeting. In London, it's important, but I'll only be gone 4 days, 5 at most. Is it the same as last time? She asked quietly. Will you miss things? I'll be back before you know it, he said, reaching for his coffee. And I'll call every night. She nodded but didn't smile. The days before he left were tense. He tried to act normal, helping with homework, asking about her day, but she could feel him pulling away already halfway across the ocean in his mind. She stopped playing the piano, not because she was angry, but because the music felt pointless if no one was really listening. He left on a Friday. She stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. Then she went to her room and closed the door. The first night he called right before bedtime, just like he promised. His voice sounded tired but warm. "How was your day?" "Fine," she said. "Did you practice?" "No." There was a pause. "Okay, well, I'll call tomorrow." The second night he called later. She was already in bed. "Sorry, I'm late," he said. The meeting ran long. "It's okay," she said, though it wasn't. The third night, he didn't call at all. She waited until midnight, then turned off her lamp and stared at the ceiling. The apartment felt huge and empty, like a museum after hours. She got up, walked to the living room, and sat at the piano. But when she placed her hands on the keys, nothing came. The music was gone. The fourth night, he called just as she was falling asleep. "Maya, hey, sweetheart. I'm so sorry I got caught up in negotiations. It's been crazy here. It's fine," she said, voice flat. "You sound upset." "I'm not. You are." She didn't answer. "Look," he said, softer now. "I know I've been distracted. But this deal, it's going to change everything for us. I'm doing this so you never have to worry about anything again." "I don't care about the deal," she said, and her voice cracked just a little. "I care about you being here." He was quiet for a long time. "I'll be home tomorrow. I promise." But he wasn't. A storm hit London, flights were delayed, and he didn't get back until Sunday evening, 2 days late. She heard his key in the door, the soft thud of his suitcase hitting the floor. She didn't go out to greet him. He found her in her room, packing a small duffel bag. "What are you doing?" he asked, standing in the doorway. "Going back to Oakwood," she said, not looking at him. "Why?" "I'm home now." "You said you'd be back Thursday," she said, folding a sweater with careful precision. "You said you'd call every night." "You didn't." "I told you things came up. It wasn't my fault. But it's always something, isn't it?" she said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were dry, but her voice trembled. "First Tokyo, now London. What's next? Paris, Sydney? How many times do you get to leave before I stop waiting?" He stepped into the room. "Maya, please." "I'm trying." "Trying isn't enough," she said. "You keep saying you're different, but when it matters, you're still the same man who walked into Oakwood and made a joke about adopting someone like it was nothing." "That's not fair," he said, stung. "Maybe not," she said, "but it's true. You keep choosing your work over me, over us. And I'm tired of being the thing you come back to when there's nothing else left." He didn't know what to say, because she was right. She zipped the bag. "I know you never really wanted to keep me. You just felt bad, and that's okay. But I can't keep pretending it's enough." She walked past him, heading for the door. He followed. "Where will you go?" "Oakwood. Mrs. Alvarez said I can stay as long as I need." "You can't just leave," he said, panic rising in his voice. "You're 10 years old." "I've been taking care of myself since I was 5, she said, stopping in the hallway. "I know how to pack. I know how to be quiet. I know how to not be a burden." "You're not a burden," he said, voice breaking. "Then why do you keep acting like I am?" she asked softly. He had no answer. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. He followed, not touching her, just walking beside her like a shadow. In the lobby, he flagged a cab. The driver rolled down the window. "Where to?" he asked. "Oakwood Children's Home," she said. He looked at the man standing beside her. Suit rumpled, eyes red-rimmed, looking more lost than powerful. "You her dad?" The question hung in the air. He opened his mouth. Closed it, then quietly. "Yes." The driver nodded. "All right, then. Hop in." She got in the back seat. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, rain starting to fall again. Just like that first day. She rolled down the window. "You don't have to keep me," she said. "I know you never really wanted to." Then she pulled the window up, and the cab drove away. He stood there for a long time, rain soaking through his coat, watching the taillights disappear into the city. Back at Oakwood, everything felt familiar. The smell of soup in the kitchen, the creak of the hallway floorboards, the sound of kids laughing in the common room. Mrs. Alvarez hugged her without asking questions. "Your room's ready," she said simply. That night, Maya lay in the narrow bed listening to the soft breathing of the girl in the next bunk. It should have felt like coming home, but it just felt like giving up. The next morning, she avoided the piano. She helped set tables for breakfast, played checkers with a younger boy, folded laundry. Anything to keep her hands busy, her mind quiet. But by afternoon, she couldn't resist. She walked to the music room, sat at the old upright and pressed a key. The note was slightly off, still out of tune, but it was hers. She began to play. Not a sad song, not an angry one. Just a simple melody about rain and waiting and the sound of a city at night. Mrs. Alvarez stood in the doorway, listening. When Maya finished, she said, "He called." Maya didn't look up. "What did you tell him?" "That you're safe. That you're here. That you need space." Maya nodded. "He sounded different," Mrs. Alvarez added gently. "Not like the man who walked in here making jokes. More like someone who just lost something precious." Maya didn't answer, but that night she dreamed of a penthouse with a grand piano and a man who used to hum off-key. He didn't show up the next day. Or the day after. She almost hoped he would, just so she could see if he'd really changed or if he'd just come to take her back because it was convenient. On the fourth day, she got a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter, handwritten on thick paper. She opened it slowly. It didn't say "I'm sorry" right away. It didn't make excuses. Instead, it told a story. "When I was a boy, my father left. Not all at once. He stayed in the house, ate at the table, came to school events. But his mind was always somewhere else. In deals, in numbers, in the future he was building. I used to sit at the top of the stairs and listen to him talk on the phone, hoping one day he'd say my name. He never did. I swore I'd never be like him. But somewhere along the way, I became him. I thought success meant never stopping, never slowing down. I didn't realize I was building a life with no one in it. You showed me what I was missing. Not with words, with music. With quiet mornings and burnt toast and the way you look at the sky like it's full of secrets. You didn't need me to be rich. You just needed me to be there. I failed you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can stay. If you're willing, I'll be at the park across from Oakwood every afternoon at 4. I'll sit on the bench near the oak tree. No pressure, no expectations, just if you want to talk, I'll be there." She read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it under her pillow. The next day at 4, she walked to the park. He was there, sitting on the bench, hands on his knees, staring at the ground like he was afraid to look up. He didn't wear a suit. Just jeans and a sweater like any other person. She stood a few feet away. He looked up. Didn't smile. Didn't reach for her. Just said "Hi, hi," she said. They sat in silence for a while, watching pigeons peck at crumbs. Finally, he said, "I quit my job." She turned to him. "What? The company? The board, all of it. I'm stepping down. Why?" "Because I realized something," he said, looking at her. "The most important thing I'll ever build isn't a skyscraper or a business. It's a family. And I almost lost mine before it even began." She didn't say anything, but she moved closer on the bench. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I'll probably mess up again. But I'm learning." "Every day," she nodded. Then quietly, "I missed your humming." He laughed, a real laugh, soft and surprised. "Even when I get the tune wrong?" "Especially then." They sat there until the sun dipped below the trees. And for the first time in weeks, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. The park bench became their quiet ritual. Every afternoon at 4, he'd be there. Sometimes with a paper bag of warm pastries, sometimes with nothing but the day's newspaper tucked under his arm. She'd show up when she felt ready, never on a schedule, never with promises. Some days they'd talk about school, or the weird cloud shapes, or the stray cat that had started hanging around Oakwood's back gate. Other days they'd just sit in silence, watching kids chase each other across the grass, the wind rustling through the oak leaves above them. He never pushed. Never asked when she'd come home. He just showed up, and slowly, without either of them saying it out loud, trust began to grow back, not like a sudden bloom, but like roots spreading deep into soil after a long drought. One rainy Tuesday, she didn't go to the park. Instead, she waited by the window at Oakwood until she saw his car pull up to the curb. He got out, holding an umbrella, and looked toward the building like he wasn't sure if he should knock. She opened the front door before he could decide. "I'm ready," she said. He didn't smile right away. He just nodded, like he understood how big those 2 words were. "Okay," he said. "Let's go home." This time it really felt like home. He'd changed things while she was gone, not the furniture or the fancy art on the walls, but the rhythm of the place. The grand piano was still there, but now there were mismatched mugs in the cupboard, a stack of library books on the coffee table, and a small potted plant on the windowsill that she'd once said she liked. He'd even framed the photo Mrs. Alvarez had given her, the one of her at the old piano, and hung it in the hallway. That night she played again. Not for an audience, not for a recital, just for herself. And he sat on the couch, eyes closed, listening like every note mattered. Over the next few months, life settled into something new, not perfect, but real. He started a small consulting business from home, taking only projects that allowed him to be present. He came to parent-teacher conferences. He helped her build a bird feeder for the balcony. He learned to make her favorite pancakes, slightly burnt at the edges, just how she liked them, and she began to call him Dad. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic moment. It just slipped out one morning when she was half asleep, and he handed her a cup of hot chocolate. "Thanks, Dad," she mumbled, then froze, eyes wide. He paused too. Then softly, with a smile that reached his eyes, "You're welcome, sweetheart." After that, it stuck. Years passed. She grew taller, her hands stronger, her music deeper. She kept playing, entering competitions, joining youth orchestras, even composing her own pieces. He never missed a performance, not one. He'd sit in the front row, hands folded, eyes bright, clapping louder than anyone else. When she turned 16, she was invited to audition for a prestigious music conservatory. The piece she chose was the Moonlight Sonata, the same one she'd played that rainy day at Oakwood. After her audition, the panel was silent for a long moment. Then the lead judge said, "That wasn't just technique. That was a story." "Who taught you to play like that?" "No one," she said. "I taught myself, but someone taught me to believe it mattered." She got in. On the night before she was set to leave for her first semester, they sat on the balcony, sharing a bowl of strawberries. The city lights shimmered below, quiet and endless. "I'm proud of you," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you," she said. "You would," he said gently. "You were always going to be here. I just got lucky enough to walk beside you for a while." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're stuck with me, you know, even when I'm away." "I know," he said, wrapping an arm around her, "and I wouldn't have it any other way." 4 years later, she stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, heart pounding, fingers cool and steady. Tonight was her professional debut, a solo performance with a full orchestra. The program included works by Chopin, Debussy, and as the final piece, her own composition, The Oak Tree, a tribute to rainy afternoons, second chances, and the quiet strength of someone who showed up when it mattered most. She peeked through the curtain. The hall was packed, elegant dresses, tuxedos, programs fluttering like birds. And there, in the very center of the front row, sat him, older now, hair more gray than black but sitting up straight, eyes fixed on the stage like he was already listening. She took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and walked out. The applause was warm, respectful. She bowed, sat at the grand piano, and placed her hands on the keys. Then she began. The music flowed, sometimes fierce, sometimes tender, always honest. She played like she was telling her whole story, the loneliness, the hope, the broken promises, the quiet healing. When she reached the oak tree, she closed her eyes and let her fingers remember every rainy day, every park bench, every "I'm sorry," every "I'm proud of you." When the final note faded into silence, the hall was still for a heartbeat. Then applause. Not polite, not reserved, thunderous. People stood. Tears glistened in the lights. She stood, bowed, and looked out at the crowd. And there he was on his feet, clapping harder than anyone. Tears streaming down his face, smiling like he'd just witnessed a miracle. After the concert, she found him waiting in the green room, holding a single white rose. "You were magnificent," he said, voice thick. She hugged him tightly. "I dedicated the last piece to you." "I know," he whispered into her hair. "I heard every word." Later, as they walked out into the cool New York night, she linked her arm through his. "Remember that day at Oakwood? When you said, 'If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her'?" He chuckled softly. "I was such a fool. But you kept your word," she said, "even when you didn't mean to." "I didn't keep it because of the piano," he said, stopping under a street lamp. "I kept it because of you. Because you made me want to be someone worth believing in." She smiled. "And you are." They walked on, past taxis and neon signs, past strangers rushing home, and in that moment, they weren't the millionaire and the orphan anymore. They were just a father and his daughter, two people who'd found each other in the rain, and chose every single day after to stay. Years later, when people asked how she became the pianist she was, she never talked about talent or training. She'd just say, "I had someone who listened." And in a quiet apartment not far from Carnegie Hall, an old upright piano sat in the corner of a cozy living room, slightly out of tune. One pedal squeaky, middle C still chipped. It wasn't played often, but sometimes on rainy afternoons a man would sit down, press a key and smile as the note rang out. Simple, imperfect, and full of love.